Welcome, dear friend, whether you're watching on the YouTube channel or listening on the podcast. I bid you a very warm welcome. And I thank you so much for deciding to join me on this journey. And it's a journey framed by these two questions. How did we break? And how do we heal? And these interviews are interviews with guides who can help us explore and traverse the terrain that we need to explore and traverse in order to uncover and develop answers to these two questions. Today's guide is Rabbi Jeff Roth. Rabbi Jeff is the founder and director of the Awakened Heart Project for Contemplative Judaism. He has led over 200 Jewish mindful meditation retreats over the last 20 years and was the co-founder of Elat Chayyim, the Jewish Spiritual Retreat Center, where he served as executive director and spiritual director for 13 years. Rabbi Jeff is the author of 2 books, Jewish Meditation Practices for Everyday Life and Me, Myself and God. He was ordained by Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi as well as by the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and Rabbi Jeff lives in the United States of America in the Hudson River Valley with his partner, Rabbi Joanna Katz. Rabbi Jeff Roth, thank you so much for your time. Welcome to the Agent of History podcast. It's a real honor and privilege for you to join me and help me on my journey. So thank you so much for being with me today and with us.
Thank you. I've been happy to get to meet you and to hear about your journey and start sharing with you some of my thoughts and your thoughts. It's been fun. It should be fun to do this today.
Thank you. So as you know, it's a journey that is, for the time being, at least structured by these two huge questions of how did we break and how do we heal? And I'm so excited to be with you to explore those questions from a rabbinic point of view, from a mystical Jewish point of view, which is, as we'll see, a very different understanding and interpretation of the Judaism that I grew up with as a Jewish person. So let's begin with the first question. How did we break?
Good. So these two questions that you're asking are questions that many people are concerned with, not just from a Jewish point of view, obviously, and but from a Jewish point of view, Jewish people are also concerned about this question. So I believe the questions you're asking are directly addressed in the Torah, in the books of Genesis and Exodus, at least from the Jewish point of view. The teachings that get revealed in those 2 books relative to what you're interested in are actually universal teaching, and they appear in this Jewish story, this Jewish version as well. So in that sense, the book of Genesis turns out to be a story of this. How did it break? What went wrong in the human experience? That's really quite clear from the beginning of the book. That's what the story is about. What went wrong in the human experience? And it uses the language of exile from the Garden of Eden. I think most people know that story. That in a sense, okay, there's some sort of paradise kind of existence, and then something goes wrong, and we get kicked out of the garden. So it's quite clear that the story is addressing the same thing you're asking. And then the way the Torah is laid out in the first 2 books. The second book, the book of Exodus, which is not the Hebrew name, but it's actually it's the question you're raising. The book of Exodus is, well, what's the way out of the break? How do we get out of that problem? The book of Genesis describes, I think, not the creation of planet Earth, but actually the creation of human beings. And then what happened with human beings, which is the break you're talking about. And essentially tells a story about how the break happened. And I think you could say the book of Genesis then sort of described the downward slide of human history in its big sense, ending with human slavery. Sort of gets to the point of human slavery. So you could say, from your perspective, maybe that human slavery is sort of the ultimate expression of how broken things are. And the solution that's proposed in the book of Exodus is a way out of the problem, but it's not a way out that has happened yet. There are actually essential insights, I think, in the book and in the revelation of Exodus that point the way to how we could get out. And in the Jewish world, that the way to understand even the value of that story in the book of Exodus really has been arising over the last 3,000 years since the story in theory happened 3,000 years ago. But understanding the story and understanding the revelation is an ongoing process that I would say we're just starting to get close to. We get closer to it in a Jewish point of view in the evolution of Jewish mysticism. And the main important teachings from Jewish mysticism don't really come around or start till about the 1200s of the Common Era, and then get exposed a little bit more in the 1600s in Sfat, and then we have in Safed in Israel, there's a Kabbalistic growth in understanding, and then another huge shift when the Hasidic mystics started teaching, which is in the 1700s, led by Israel Ben Eliezer, who's known as the master of the good name, the Baal Shem Tov. So all of those things I want to address with you, probably in two different teachings. One is about the brokenness, and then the healing, which comes in Exodus, but only with Exodus being understood over many years, the depth of what was revealed there. I think it's still just being revealed in a certain way and understood, or understood from a new perspective, a Jewish mystical perspective.
So there's that's an amazing layout of the territory to explore, and we'll do that in these two separate 45-minute or so discussions and conversations. And but it does suggest even kind of that the answer to how we heal has an element of the evolution of our consciousness itself that we are still learning, that's still unfolding, and of course. Yeah, the question is so profoundly as relevant today as it ever was.
Let me say it in a simple way. The solution to the break is contained within a simple yet complex teaching that comes out of the mystical tradition, which is that everything is God and nothing but God, which is going to be a way of understanding the divine from a radically immanent point of view. And that is not the original understanding of the divine in Judaism, maybe in other traditions as well. It's still not the way most religious people understand the divine. But clearly the biblical text of Genesis is going to be talking about a radically other, even in the trappings, male other divine figure that created the world. And that is not the theology that I'm teaching from. I'm teaching from this, as you said, this evolutionary way of seeing what the divine is, and how radically different it is to say everything is God, nothing but God, because that statement alone says there's no break anymore. There can't be a break in God.
Right. So on one level, and I've discussed this with another theologian, a Christian mystic, Reverend Stephen Wright, about on one level, of course, the most essential level, where there is no break. And I just wanted to point out, I suppose, to anyone listening to this or watching this who holds an atheism, what I would say is certainly stick around, because we're not talking about the vengeful male transcendent God, who's above us, judging us, that I grew up on and came to fall out of love with. And,
right. Yeah,
talking about something far different.
The cute way of saying that, cute is the right word, but people are saying the God you don't believe in doesn't exist.
Right.
We're talking about a whole different way of understanding theology.
So maybe then, if we start this journey at, excuse the pun, in the beginning.
Yeah, I agree. Perfect.
We could start with the very first line, maybe, of the book of Genesis, of the Torah.
Okay, well, if since you're leading in with that question, the opening.
Oh no, we don't have to.
The opening line. Most people, until it's been pointed out to you, most people believe, who've read the Torah or the Bible, believe it starts with "in the beginning." That's the opening words, which are not the opening words of the Torah. it's a misunderstanding of the language of the Torah as it's been received in the Jewish tradition, which is, you'd have to say, if you look at the words carefully, you understand Hebrew grammar, the opening words are in a beginning, without a doubt. There's no doubt about that.
It's not definitely
once you have punctuation in Hebrew. Like Hebrew was originally written without punctuation, so it was a little bit more open to misunderstanding. But the Jewish understanding of the grammar of that sentence, without a doubt, this is not, anybody who knows Hebrew would agree on this. It says in the beginning, not in the beginning. And that's a way of pointing out, it's not trying to talk about the beginning of the universe or the beginning of planet Earth. It's much closer to once upon a time. And I'm going to tell you a story about what happened once upon a time. And the story that we're going to tell you once upon a time is how the brokenness happened in human beings. Exactly the question you're asking. How did that happen? And so I think the story is, in fact, this opening story in the Torah, but the opening way of discussing the question you're asking about is what happened in the human experience? How did human beings come onto the planet? And then what went wrong in the human experience about brokenness? Because I would assert, I'd be interested in your comment, but I would assert that outside of the human race, there is no brokenness. It doesn't even seem that there's any brokenness. I mean, animals eat other animals. It's not pleasant, but that's the way it is. It's not broken. But I think it makes sense to talk about brokenness when you get to human beings, and that the fundamental brokenness we're talking about comes out of misperception, comes out of something happened in the human experience that made us begin to see the world not from the way it really is, from a basic fundamental misperception, and that fundamental misperception is seeing it as a dualistic experience, not as a single unfolding event. And that's why that opening theology statement, everything is God and nothing but God, is a way of saying there is no brokenness. There is, all separation is an illusion. But out of that illusion, human beings act tremendously in negative ways that cause tremendous harm to ourselves, to each other, to the planet. So I'll come back in a second. I'll let you just respond to that, how you could see that in the book of Genesis and what I think the fundamental problem is.
Yeah, I just to add something that I have learned is that there's, I believe, a lot of commentary on why the first letter of the Torah is not Aleph, the first letter of the alphabet, the Aleph-Bet, the Hebrew alphabet, but Bet, the second letter, and the learning that I've found out is that this is an expression of exactly this dualism itself, the one becoming the two through this dualism that is evolving in human consciousness.
Right, and so the fact that the Torah then says, like, we're going to give you once upon a time, we're going to tell you how the Bet story arose, how the dualistic story arose. And the solution, which we're not going to talk about in this section, but it's going to be starting with the letter Aleph. The solution is it comes as an Aleph story rather than one. So there is a real understanding of the one that is a revelation. That is the revelation of at Mount Sinai, and so we'll come to that. But let's start with the brokenness. Since we wanted once upon a time, how did it break? So to put it in non-theological terms and non-religious terms per se, everybody would agree that human beings are of the species that we call Homo sapiens. And Homo sapiens have not always been on the planet. It seems like Homo sapiens, that species, has been around 170,000 years, 200,000 years, somewhere like that, somewhere in that range. There's probably a more exact date these days, but it's somewhere in that range. And those Homo sapiens, when whatever genetic changes allowed for that species to arise, set up a potentiality for the species to develop differently than other species had. And the major difference that I think is important to us, and is the key to this question you're asking, is at some point Homo sapiens learned speech and language. And by speech and language, I mean the same kind of speech and language we would say today, that this is, it's made up of conceptual abstractions. That language is made up of concepts, and they are abstractions and names that point to experiences. But that's I would suggest is a fairly unique experience of our species. It seems like maybe some other species are capable of some level of abstraction, but for our species, it became the centerpiece of how Homo sapiens began to function in the world, filled with brains that are then organized to see the world through the lens of speech and language. And you could say in a more everyday terms, we want to talk about beliefs and views and opinions. That those things are made up of words and concepts, and that's what uniquely makes us human beings. So I like to think about speech and language as the origin of human beings, sort of coming out of the species Homo sapiens. That potential was always there. As we all know, human children don't automatically have speech and language. It has to be taught. So somewhere it had to be created before it could be taught. And it came about slowly. And most people who have studied the development of language say that essentially it's only about 30,000 years old. So the species may be 200,000 years old, but so for the first 140,000 years, the archaeological record stays pretty consistent. The Homo sapiens lived in small tribes, pretty similar to the way the great apes live, tribes of 30 individuals, no extraordinary development. And then something really shifted 30,000 years ago. And all of a sudden, the species, it lives differently. It's the start of all the revolutions in agriculture and technology. All of that starts just 30,000 years ago. And most people credit that shift to this ability to have speech and language. That's what shifted. So speech and language was a fantastic development and a fantastic tool. And it had, from my perspective, one very serious side effect. You know, like when you watch these commercials about medicines and they're so great, oh, this medicine's so great. They tell you that for about 30 seconds. And then for 2 minutes, they have to tell you all the ways it could kill you. So, all right, so there's a bad side effect of speech and language, which I think is the break. And the bad side effect of speech and language is it solidified a basic misperception of reality that we could call the dualistic misperception. That concepts themselves, the way concepts work in as a function, is to divvy up this whole universe, which is all what I would say one part of a great single unfolding of being, of interbeing, that everything inter is with everything else that is. We don't see that through the lens of concepts, because concepts, the whole point of a concept is to abstract out of the whole unfolding of being some little narrow focus and give it a name and it's really helpful and really functional for something, but it does make us believe that things are different than each other. This thing is not the same as this thing. So for the example I always like to use, which will just fun to use it because it'll come in here in a moment in the book of Genesis, as a tree. You know, we're going to talk about the trees in the garden, these two trees in the Garden of Eden. A tree is a concept. So in order for a tree to exist, everything else in the universe has to not be that tree. For the concept of a tree, everything has to not be even conceptually trees. And then for a particular tree, everything in the universe has to not be that particular tree. And that's essentially a misperception. That is the dualistic misperception, that every concept is only a concept in relation to the rest of the world not being that concept, outside. So everything outside some boundary is not the tree, and only inside the boundary is the tree.
I'd just like to kind of emphasize, if I may, just emphasize at this stage, though, the utility of that, the indispensability of that in terms of our evolution, in terms of more and more complex social forms. If I'm working on a building site and I say, pass me that spanner, it has to be the spanner, so in terms of our collaboration, our capacity, the social power, in Marxist language, the social power of cooperation, like all of these things are really essential. I just wanted to underline.
That most people who have really looked at the development of language think that it probably started with hunting. It's really helpful. You really want to be able to communicate somehow between the party that's hunting, where to look, like here rather than there. And what are you looking for? Are you looking for a fox or a deer, or watch out for that bear? Or, so the different, it helps to have names for the different creatures and abstractions. That helps. That communication is exactly what you were saying. That is probably how speech and language arose originally. And original languages have much more onomatopoeia in them. One of the beautiful things about Hebrew, one of the things that makes Hebrew worth looking at is it is one of the most ancient families of languages. So there's actually a lot of secrets, so to speak, encoded in the language just because it's old. It's sort of really close to when the sound of a concept had something to do with, intrinsically connected to what the concept was trying to point to. So, as I said, a lot of onomatopoeia. So I think
there's another saying that is a real unity of sound and meaning.
There's a much more. It's much more abstract now. So with this fundamental misperception of the dualistic misperception, that is how you get. Not originally, this was not the first thing that arose in speech and language, but eventually it moves itself around to the sense and the concept of a separate self. That I'm me and I'm not you. And that's convenient for, it's helpful because you sleep in your house and I sleep in my house. There's some convenient things about it. But to the extent that we see the whole universe that way as separate, everything is separate from everything else, then that does allow for selfishness to arise and self-centeredness to arise. The whole way the mind of a human being, of a Homo sapien, began to be organized as human beings was to be self-centered. And that's the break. We're broken in the sense that we're not seeing how, just like I know my right hand, my right hand knows my left hand is not a separate entity. So I don't go like taking advantage of it and stick something in there, And if you could see clearly, you wouldn't do that to another human being either. Because we're all part of one great unfolding.
Or on a cellular level, obviously how in normal circumstances at least, like the however many millions or billions of cells we have in our bodies are in a cooperative symbiotic relationship is characterized by cooperation.
So like if we go back to a tree is really a process unfolding. It's not a thing. Actually, nothing is a thing. Everything is inging. So a tree is a process that's unfolding and moving and changing, constantly growing, shedding things, taking things in. It's in constant flux of exchange with its environment. Things that were at one point outside what you call the tree are now inside the tree. It's all moving. It's constantly moving. And a tree is a sort of an arbitrary point, like taking a snapshot of a river and saying, "Oh, look at." Or it's like it'd be like driving to Niagara Falls. This is an American metaphor, obviously, but and 100 miles away, you pass a billboard that says Niagara Falls ahead with a picture, and you jump out of the car like, "Wow, Niagara Falls! It's so great." It's not the picture. The picture's just pointing towards the thing, and the thing is inging. It's always moving. That's what's magnificent about it. So this is the story of Genesis. And the way that Genesis, I think, is telling the story of when Homo sapiens became human beings. And it tells the story by having a garden, a paradise. And in that paradise, the story says there are these two trees. There's the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And you can eat of all the trees. In the middle of the garden is this tree of life. You can eat of all the trees except the tree of knowing good and evil, because it says, on the day you eat from that tree, you will surely die. So this is the point in the story of the Garden of Eden, of moving into the dualistic misperception that came out of speech and language. So And it's
What is it? Can I just ask? What is it in the text in those early chapters that points to speech and language? Is there anything that points to speech and language specifically?
Yeah. So when the human beings first come into being in the second chapter of Genesis, the human being, Adam he's called Adam. Adam means earth. So the earthling, who's part of the earth, needs to develop. And so even before the story of the tree, the earthling is told to name everything. It actually specifically says name everything. If you want to turn the rest of the universe into something that you can use, because the whole point of naming was to make it useful for the self, really. But that's what Adam was instructed to do, is to name all the beasts of the field in order to make them helpmates instead of beasts. It's taming the whole world by naming it.
There's another element here as well, which I think will come even more into light, maybe when we explore the healing element, which is that God spoke the world into creation itself. God says, "Let there be," and lo, there was. So there's the creative power.
There's a tremendous creative power of language, but again, I would say not again. I think that's a projection on the part of human beings. We spoke the world. We spoke the world. It's actually, I used to think it was a metaphor. Oh, God spoke the world into being, like what? Yelled out these loud words, and the words became. It's not a metaphor, actually. The worlds we live in are all created by speech and language, right? Cultures are created through speech and language. The sense of a self is created through speech and language. So everything we think of as a world, everything we think of conceptually, was in fact created out of speech and language. And then that speech and language reifies into the conditions we actually live in. So we live in a world that actually was created through speech and language. It just was, the key difference is that as human beings did it. Now, if everything is God, nothing but God, then all right, part of the God process resulted in speech and language. So it fits that way. But look at this story of the tree. First of all, people will talk about this tree you're not supposed to eat from is the tree of knowledge, as if there's something wrong with knowledge. I think it's totally a misuse of the teaching. I think it should never be called the tree of knowledge. It's the tree of knowing good and bad. It's very explicit. It's not the tree of knowledge. It's the tree of knowing of good and bad. Right there is the dualistic perspective. There was no good and bad before that. There's no good and bad outside of human speech. And in fact, before the expulsion, you see, there's just good. But it's not everything that came into being was all good. Everything coming into being is good. But it's not a good that has a bad. It's not the kind of good that is the dualistic good. It's just, of course, everything that came into being is like being is inherently okay. It's only the dualistic perspective that some things about being are bad. There's no good and bad before that. So, in that story, even the line about it says, on the day, watch out, don't eat from that tree, because if you eat from that tree, you're going to die. It's really saying that the break is going to happen. If you eat from that tree, the break's going to happen. And as we know, they did eat from that tree. One of the things I might say about this, one of the more controversial things I say to people, and then if they reflect on it, but there's no death before eating from that tree of knowing of good and bad. That's just recycling. That's like recycling is always happening. There's no separate self, and there's no death per se. It's just death is a concept. And I'm not saying that things don't decay, including us, human beings, and it is tremendously sad. And there's some phenomena we're referring to when the life force, makes its next move, and it is something to be sad about. But we misperceive it. We totally misperceive it, and we're so afraid of the other and of death, and that just reinforces this sense of separateness, sense of selfishness. And so the way the story unfolds, just following exactly what you're trying to talk about with people, is that you shouldn't do that. That is a warning, but it's an after the fact warning. It's sort of human beings sort of intuiting what went wrong. Because these are the stories. So like if you're asking the question of what's broken, that's people have human beings probably been asking that question as soon as they realized that they were human beings and came into this sense of dualistic misperception. From the beginning of language on, they must have been saying, what went wrong? What happened? And so then they made up stories about what happened. And these are like the earliest stories ever made up about what happened. Because Hebrew is an old language. It's an old story. It's a very old story. So this is the story of what went wrong. We got into this sense of a separate self, where the language that the story uses, then that means you're kicked out of the garden. Now that that's happened, you're no longer in this non-dualistic, whatever you might call it, nibbana, enlightenment. Although before speech and language, there probably wasn't enlightenment either. It's not bad that speech and language came into being, even though there's been so many bad side effects. It also has propelled us forward. It gives us some of the tools to propel us forward in wisdom and understanding. So I'm not trying to say language is bad; it just had a really bad side effect, like those commercials. So
maybe it's maybe to think about it in terms of the way that a baby comes into the world. Its experiences of non-duality has, at least at the very start, perhaps no sense at all of its separateness.
Yeah, but it needs to make sense.
But it also has very little, has almost no capacity to act in the world and on the world.
Yeah, and has not yet acquired wisdom. I mean, it has whatever inherent wisdom is in the biology. Like it actually, sure. So a baby does know to turn towards a smiling face. Doesn't have to be taught that. So some of the wisdom comes through the genetics and the biology, but most of the wisdom has to be acquired. And so language is great, but it has this side effect. We lose our sense of interconnectivity. We're not in the garden anymore. So the next chapter, as soon as you eat from it, then is the story being. It says now you're kicked out. Now Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden, and the very next story is murder. Once you're kicked out of the garden in chapter 4, so chapter 3 you're kicked out of the garden. Chapter 4 of Genesis is already the first murder.
It's not just murder.
It's all down.
It's fratricide, isn't it? I mean, is that the word? I mean, it's a brother killing a brother.
Yes.
It's awful.
So then if you look at the next story after Cain killing Abel, the next story, which is essentially the story around Noah, is that this whole human thing was a failure. This is a broken failure as a system and should get wiped off the planet. And maybe that would have been a better outcome. Maybe that is the outcome. It's just it's been taking a while. It's actually, maybe it's a prediction, and Noah's Ark is just about to happen. The waters are going to get higher, and so. But it certainly is telling a story of just how bad human beings are. At the core of how bad human beings are, I think you could say it's thinking. Thinking is the problem. Conceptual thinking. So the word thinking in the Bible, the first time the word thinking is in the Bible is in the story of Noah and the ark, where it says, Kol machshavat libo rak ra kol hayom, that the thoughts of the heart of a human being are evil all day. So, right? And if you start to look in the Torah, almost every time the word thought is frequently paired with evil. Those two words literally appear in the same sentence. And if you look just at the word thinking and say, how is thinking used in Torah? It basically means scheming, conniving. It leads to evil. And so thinking, conceptual thinking, this is the side effect of the conceptual thinking, that human beings are going to be completely broken and do the things we do. And then, so the story of Genesis is essentially, how bad can it get? How bad can it get? It can get to the point where human beings enslave other human beings. And
can I just ask, because
by the way, that's the place we're still in. As a race, there's some good things happening. So in Genesis, there are some moments of awakening that will lead to the possibility of a bigger awakening in Genesis. So some of the seeds are planted as the story unfolds in Genesis. And we'll finish this up now with whatever you want to ask about. And then the way out, Exodus, we'll talk about in the next section.
Yeah, the question I had was, one thing I learned was that the word for mind is it lev, but also can mean heart. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So there is
heart-mind is one phenomenon.
Say that again. Sorry?
Heart-mind is one phenomena.
Right. So thinking is very much in contradiction or to heart-mind.
Well, thinking, I would say it this way: thinking is only one function of heart-mind. Thinking,
right,
heart-mind does have thoughts. The thoughts are the problem. That's where the evil is in the thoughts. That's why it says all the thoughts of the heart. It doesn't say the heart is evil all day. It doesn't say the heart-mind is evil all day. The thoughts of the heart-mind are evil all day. Its feelings are not evil. Its openness, its ability to perceive, to know, that's not evil. Just the evil's in the thinking. So that we'll come back to that too. If the ultimate solution is going to be to change our relationship to thoughts and language. We're still going to think, and we're still going to have language, but we need to treat thoughts and language differently. And in the next section, I'll point out how you could see, how do we get to that? What are some of the insights about how to get to that place?
Before we do go there to that how do we heal? How do we heal? There's a question I'd like to ask you about language, because I guess the question is, why did whoever wrote the book of Genesis, why did they write then in such coded form? Why did they write in ways that needed to be deciphered in all of these incredibly complex, rich, and beautiful ways?
I would say they didn't.
Why didn't they just spell it out?
No, they didn't. It was not a conscious choice to be deceptive. I don't think that the early storytellers told stories. Storytellers incorporate the wisdom they have from life, and they have the moral of the story. So they were telling stories that they heard from their grandparents. They made up stories as they went. Good storytellers changed the story. So the story of what happened, what went wrong, was told as an oral story for 10,000. I was told for 10,000 years before it got written down. But even from the history of Torah on its own, the stories, because speech and language arose 30,000 years ago. Writing is only about 2,500 years old. No, 3,500 years. The very beginning of writing is only 3,500 years ago. So for the first 27,000 years, language was an oral tradition, solely oral tradition. And so the story unfolded. It wasn't like somebody was thinking ahead of time, okay, how can I tell that so someday somebody will figure this out? No, they told the story the best way they knew how to tell the story. Those storytellers were caught in the same broken delusion, and they gave it their best shot at how did this happen? So this is the way I'm interpreting the tree of knowing of good and evil as the origin of speech and language. That's a contemporary interpretation. It wasn't, but it's so pregnant. It was like the image caught something very deep, and it certainly did catch. Once you say it's the tree of knowing good and bad, I think there was an explicit understanding that now we're going to talk about dualism, even though they didn't necessarily have a language of dualism, non-dualism. Like, how come we live in a world with good and bad?
I also wonder, this is very speculative, but I also wonder as well if, as we've discussed already, that there is an incredible creative and necessary creative power in speech and language. And so that it's not the only way out is not through a rejection of language or something. It's through language itself. And so what you're doing is a whole method of deconstruction.
Yeah.
So it's actually kind of going through language as a journey of redemption and restoration.
Absolutely, we'll talk about that in the next segment. Jewish mysticism, not every mysticism is exactly the same of different cultures, but Jewish mysticism is heavily, heavily based as language mysticism. It very much uses letters and words and language and turning the letters into numbers. So it's very much the basic methodology of Jewish mysticism is to work with language and as you said, to deconstruct language. And that's how you can break through the previous beliefs and views and opinions. If the words don't mean what they used to mean, and if word is actually a number and not a word altogether, so now you can deconstruct language, which is a way out of the misperceptions that without doing that, then the story tells itself over and over the same way. But once you can deconstruct the story, then you can start to have a new perspective.
Wonderful. So I think that's a really exciting place to leave the first chapter. We need to move on to the second chapter, in which you'll lead us through a deconstruction towards a path out to a path of restoration and healing, which is the Aleph story, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
So thank you for now. Thank you so much for your wisdom. Thank you.
Okay.